The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of Raven's Hollow Palace, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the sprawling gardens below. Inside the grand study, King Edmund Blackthorne sat behind his mahogany desk, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held a letter that would change everything. The ornate crown that had rested upon his head for 37 years suddenly felt heavier than ever before. "Your Majesty," his private secretary, Lord Harrison, spoke softly from the doorway. "Prince Alexander is here to see you, as requested." The king nodded slowly, folding the letter carefully and placing it in the top drawer of his desk. At 68, Edmund had weathered many storms during his reign over the kingdom of Astoria, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The weight of betrayal pressed down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. Prince Alexander entered the room with his characteristic confident stride, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his royal blue uniform immaculate. At 35, he was the heir apparent, beloved by the people for his charitable work and dedication to modernizing the monarchy. Behind him walked his wife, Princess Isabella, her auburn hair catching the dim light from the crystal chandelier. She moved with the grace that had made her a favorite among the nobility when she married into the royal family 5 years ago. "Father," Alexander said, bowing slightly, "you seemed urgent in your summons. Is everything all right?" King Edmund studied his son's face carefully, searching for any sign of knowledge about what he had discovered. Alexander's blue eyes, so similar to his own, showed only concern and curiosity. Isabella stood beside her husband, her hands clasped gracefully in front of her emerald green dress, her expression appropriately respectful. "Please, both of you sit," the king said, gesturing to the leather chairs arranged before his desk. The study, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and portraits of previous monarchs, had witnessed countless important conversations throughout the centuries, but none quite like this. As they settled into their seats, the king noticed how Isabella's fingers played nervously with her wedding ring, a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to the royal family for generations. It was a subtle gesture, but one that didn't escape Edmund's keen observation. "There's something we need to discuss," the king began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Something that affects not only our family, but the very foundation of the crown itself." Alexander leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "Father, you're concerning me. What's happened?" The king reached into his drawer and withdrew a folder marked with the royal seal. Inside were documents that had arrived just hours earlier from the Royal Treasury's investigation unit. For months, there had been whispers, rumors that someone within the royal family was involved in financial improprieties. The king had dismissed them initially, believing that such accusations were merely the work of Republican sympathizers trying to damage the monarchy's reputation. But the evidence before him was undeniable. 3 months ago, the king began, "I authorized a comprehensive audit of all royal financial accounts. It was meant to be routine, something to satisfy the Parliament's new transparency requirements." He paused, watching as Isabella's face grew slightly pale. What they discovered was far from routine. The documents revealed a complex web of financial transactions that led to a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands. The account, opened under a false identity, had been receiving regular deposits from various royal charities and foundations over the past 3 years. The total amount was staggering, nearly £15 million. "I don't understand," Alexander said, though his voice had taken on a different tone. "What does this have to do with us?" The king opened the folder and spread several photographs across the desk. They showed surveillance footage from various bank visits, wire transfer records, and, most damning of all, a clear image of someone entering the Grand Cayman Banking Center. Isabella's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but it was enough to confirm what the king had feared most. The woman in the photograph, wearing large sunglasses and a distinctive emerald coat, was unmistakably the Princess of Astoria. "Isabella," the king said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. Would you care to explain why you've been making regular trips to the Cayman Islands under an assumed name? The silence in the room was deafening. Alexander turned to look at his wife, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror. Isabella's composure, which had served her so well throughout her years as a member of the royal family, finally cracked. "I can explain," she whispered, her hands shaking now as she clutched the arms of her chair. "It's not what it looks like." But even as she spoke, more evidence emerged from the folder. Bank records showed that the money hadn't just been hidden away. It had been used to purchase luxury properties in 3 different countries, all under shell companies that traced back to Isabella's maiden name, Rosenberg. The investigation had revealed that Isabella had been systematically skimming funds from royal charities for years. The Children's Foundation of Astoria, the Royal Environmental Trust, the Veterans Support Initiative, all organizations that Alexander himself had worked tirelessly to promote, had been her targets. She had used her position and knowledge of the royal financial systems to redirect donations meant for those most in need. The children's hospital wing that was supposed to be built last year, the king continued, his voice growing harder. The veteran housing project that was mysteriously delayed. The environmental research grants that were reduced by half. Do you know how many people have suffered because of your greed? Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "This can't be true," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The pieces were falling into place in his mind. Isabella's frequent, unexplained trips, her evasiveness about their personal finances, her insistence on handling certain charitable obligations herself. "There's more," the king said, producing another set of documents. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Isabella has been selling sensitive information about royal security protocols and family schedules to tabloid journalists. The recent breaches of our privacy, the paparazzi who seem to know exactly where you'd be on supposedly secret outings, it all traces back to her. Isabella finally broke completely, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in her hands. "You don't understand the pressure," she sobbed. "The constant scrutiny, the way people looked at me like I didn't belong here. I needed something that was mine, something that gave me security." "Security?" Alexander's voice was incredulous. "You had everything: title, wealth, respect, love. How could you betray not just me, but the people who trusted us?" The weight of her actions was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Isabella's betrayal went beyond mere financial crimes. She had violated the sacred trust placed in the royal family by the people of Astoria. Every charitable event she had attended, every ribbon she had cut for a new hospital or school, every speech she had given about helping the less fortunate, it had all been a lie. The king pulled out one final document, this one bearing the official seal of the Attorney General's office. "Isabella Marie Rosenberg Blackthorne," he read formally. "You are hereby stripped of all royal titles, privileges, and protections granted to you through your marriage to Prince Alexander. Furthermore, criminal charges will be filed against you for fraud, embezzlement, and treason." The word treason hung in the air like a death sentence. In Astoria, crimes against the crown were still taken with the utmost seriousness, and the penalties were severe. Isabella looked up through her tears, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Alexander, please," she begged. "You have to believe me. I never meant for it to go this far. I was going to put the money back." But Alexander had turned away from her, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens where they had once walked hand in hand, planning their future together. The man who had loved her unconditionally, who had defended her against critics who said she wasn't worthy of royal status, felt as though his entire world was collapsing. "Guards," the king called, and immediately 2 members of the royal guard entered the study. "Please escort the former Princess Isabella from the palace grounds. She is no longer welcome here." As Isabella was led away, her sobs echoing through the corridors of the palace she had called home, father and son stood in stunned silence. The implications of her actions would ripple far beyond their family. The monarchy itself would face questions about oversight and accountability. The charities would need to rebuild trust with their donors. Most personally devastating of all, Alexander would have to face the public knowing that the woman he had loved and trusted had made him an unwitting accomplice to her crimes. "How do we miss this?" Alexander asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. King Edmund placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Because we loved her," he said simply, "and sometimes love makes us blind to the darkness that can exist in another person's heart." The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and both men knew that the tempest brewing around the royal family was just beginning. The woman who had once been destined to be queen had instead become the architect of the greatest scandal in the monarchy's modern history. As night fell over Ravenshollow Palace, the kingdom of Astoria slept peacefully, unaware that their beloved Princess Isabella was gone forever, and that the royal family they trusted was about to face its greatest crisis in generations. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds that had gathered over Astoria's capital city of Golden Haven. 3 days had passed since Isabella's dramatic removal from Ravenshollow Palace, and the kingdom was still reeling from the shocking announcement that had dominated every newspaper headline and television broadcast across the nation. Prince Alexander stood at the window of his private chambers, watching as protesters gathered outside the palace gates. Some carried signs demanding justice and transparency, while others showed their support for the royal family during this unprecedented crisis. The cacophony of voices created a constant background noise that had become the soundtrack to his sleepless nights. "Your Highness," came a gentle voice from behind him. Alexander turned to see his longtime friend and advisor, Lord Geoffrey Ashworth, holding a steaming cup of tea and wearing the expression of a man bearing unfortunate news. "The Prime Minister is here to see you. She says it's urgent." Alexander accepted the tea gratefully, though he doubted anything could warm the chill that had settled into his bones since discovering his wife's betrayal. "Send her in, Geoffrey, and thank you for everything you've done these past few days. I know this situation has put you in an impossible position as well." Prime Minister Catherine Wells entered the room with her characteristic brisk efficiency, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark suit immaculate despite the early hour. She had served Astoria faithfully for 6 years, navigating the country through economic challenges and international crises, but nothing had prepared her for managing the fallout from a royal scandal of this magnitude. "Your Highness," she said, offering a brief curtsy before taking the seat Alexander gestured toward. "I wish I could say I was bringing good news, but I'm afraid the situation is becoming more complicated by the hour." Alexander settled into the chair across from her, noting how the formal address felt strange coming from a woman who had shared countless informal dinners with him and Isabella over the years. The careful distance in her tone spoke volumes about how the scandal was already changing relationships throughout the kingdom. "The international press has picked up the story," Catherine continued, opening the briefcase she'd brought with her. "CNN, BBC, Reuters, they're all running features about Isabella's alleged crimes. The Cayman Islands Banking Authority has confirmed they're cooperating with our investigation, but they've also leaked details to the media that we hadn't planned to release yet." She spread out several international newspapers across the coffee table between them. The headlines were brutal: "Royal Rogue," "Princess's Secret Millions," "Charity Fraud Rocks Kingdom," and, most damaging of all, "Can the Monarchy Survive?" The photographs accompanying the articles showed Isabella at various royal events, her smile now seeming sinister in light of recent revelations. "There's something else," Catherine said, her voice dropping lower. "Our investigators have uncovered additional bank accounts. This goes deeper than we initially thought." Alexander felt his heart sink further, something he hadn't thought possible. "How much deeper?" "At least £23 million across 7 different accounts in 5 countries: Switzerland, Monaco, Luxembourg, Singapore, and the British Virgin Islands. She's been at this for nearly 7 years, starting just 2 years into your marriage." The time frame hit Alexander like a physical blow. 7 years ago, he had been at the height of his happiness with Isabella. They had just returned from their honeymoon, and she had thrown herself into royal duties with enthusiasm that had impressed even his father's most cynical advisors. To learn that she had been planning and executing this elaborate fraud almost from the beginning of their marriage felt like a complete rewriting of his personal history. But there's more troubling news, Catherine continued. We've discovered that some of the money was used to purchase information from palace staff. She wasn't working alone. This revelation sent a chill through Alexander that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The idea that Isabella had corrupted members of the palace staff, people who had dedicated their lives to serving the royal family, added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Who? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Catherine consulted her notes. James Morrison, a footman who'd been with the family for 12 years. Margaret Sinclair, one of the housekeeping supervisors. And, most shocking of all, Thomas Hartwell. Alexander's breath caught. Thomas had been his personal valet for over a decade, a man he trusted with his most private moments and sensitive information. The thought that Thomas had been reporting his movements and conversations to Isabella for money felt like another betrayal piled upon the first. They've all been arrested, Catherine continued. Morrison and Sinclair have admitted to providing Isabella with information about your schedules and private conversations. Thomas is still maintaining his innocence, but the financial evidence is overwhelming. Isabella paid him over £50,000 over 3 years. Alexander stood and walked back to the window, watching as more protesters arrived outside the gates. Among them, he could see several signs specifically calling for his own abdication, suggesting that his failure to detect his wife's crimes made him unfit to rule. The sight made his stomach turn. The public is demanding answers, Catherine said gently. Parliament is calling for a full investigation not just into Isabella's crimes, but into the entire royal financial oversight system. There are questions about how this could have gone undetected for so long. And what are you recommending? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Complete transparency. We need to open every royal account to independent auditors. We need to implement new oversight measures that would make this kind of fraud impossible in the future. And she paused, clearly struggling with her next words. We need to consider whether additional changes are necessary. The euphemism wasn't lost on Alexander. She was suggesting that his own position might be untenable, that the scandal might require more than just Isabella's removal to restore public confidence in the monarchy. There's also the matter of the criminal proceedings, Catherine continued. Isabella's lawyers are trying to negotiate a plea bargain. They're claiming she was suffering from a mental health crisis and that her actions were the result of the pressure of royal life. Alexander turned back to face the Prime Minister, anger flashing in his eyes for the first time since the conversation began. Mental health crisis? She stole from children's charities, Catherine. She took money meant for cancer research and veteran support. How is that anything but calculated greed? Understand your anger, Your Highness. But her legal team is well-funded and experienced with high-profile cases. They're going to fight this with everything they have. They're also threatening to release what they claim are private recordings of royal family conversations unless we agree to reduce charges. This was a new bombshell that left Alexander reeling. The thought that Isabella had been secretly recording private family moments, potentially for years, added a layer of violation that went beyond financial crimes. Every intimate conversation, every family dispute, every moment of vulnerability could potentially become public ammunition in her legal defense. What kind of recordings? He asked quietly. We don't know yet. Her lawyers are being deliberately vague, but they've hinted at conversations that could be embarrassing to the crown. They want to use them as leverage. Alexander sank back into his chair, the weight of the situation feeling heavier than ever. The woman he had loved, trusted, and planned to spend his life with had not only stolen millions from charity, but had also been secretly documenting their private lives for potential use against the royal family. There's one more thing, Catherine said, clearly reluctant to continue. King Edmund wants to see you. He's He's not been well since the discovery. The palace physician is concerned about his stress levels. Alexander felt a pang of guilt add itself to the emotional turmoil he was already experiencing. His father, who had dedicated his entire life to the service of Astoria and the crown, was now facing the greatest crisis of his reign because of Alexander's choice in a wife. The knowledge that his personal failure was causing his father physical distress was almost unbearable. "I'll go to him immediately," Alexander said, standing once again. "Catherine, I want you to know that I take full responsibility for this situation. If my position is compromising the monarchy's ability to recover from this scandal, I'm prepared to discuss alternatives." The Prime Minister studied him carefully before responding. "Your Highness, the people of Astoria have loved and respected you for your entire life. Your charitable work, your military service, your dedication to modernizing the monarchy while respecting its traditions. None of that changes because of Isabella's crimes. But the path forward will require difficult decisions from all of us." As Catherine gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "There's a press conference scheduled for this afternoon. The Attorney General will be announcing the formal charges against Isabella and the corrupted staff members. The international media will be watching closely." After she left, Alexander remained alone in his chambers, surrounded by the portraits and artifacts that told the story of his family's long service to Astoria. In just 3 days, Isabella had managed to tarnish a legacy that had taken centuries to build. The trust between the royal family and the people they served, carefully cultivated over generations, had been shattered by one woman's greed and betrayal. He picked up the phone to call his father, dreading the conversation, but knowing it was necessary. As the phone rang, Alexander caught sight of himself in the ornate mirror that hung beside his desk. The man looking back at him appeared to have aged years in just 3 days, his eyes hollowed by stress and sleepless nights, his face bearing the weight of a burden he had never imagined he would have to carry. The Kingdom of Astoria was about to face its greatest constitutional crisis in modern history, and Alexander knew that his own future and that of the monarchy itself hung in the balance. The woman who had once been destined to be his queen had instead become the instrument of potential destruction for everything his family had worked to build. Outside, the protesters continued their chants, their voices carrying through the ancient walls of Raven's Hollow Palace like the sound of approaching thunder. The storm that had begun with Isabella's betrayal was far from over, and Alexander was beginning to understand that the worst was yet to come. 2 weeks had passed since the Attorney General's devastating press conference, and the Kingdom of Astoria found itself in the grip of the most serious constitutional crisis in its 800-year history. The ancient walls of Raven's Hollow Palace, which had weathered invasions, civil wars, and political upheavals, now faced their greatest threat from within. King Edmund sat in his private study, the same room where Isabella's treachery had first been revealed, but the man occupying the throne bore little resemblance to the confident monarch of just a fortnight ago. The stress of the scandal had taken a visible toll on his health. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his face gaunt from sleepless nights, and his hand showed a persistent tremor that hadn't been present before the crisis began. Dr. Elizabeth Morehouse, the royal physician, had been visiting daily, her medical bag a constant reminder of the king's declining condition. The weight of nearly 4 decades of rule, combined with the shame and disappointment of Isabella's betrayal, had pushed the 70-year-old monarch to his physical and emotional limits. "Your Majesty," Dr. Morehouse said gently as she completed her examination, "your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, and your heart rate is irregularly high. I must insist that you consider taking a leave of absence from your royal duties. The stress you're under is genuinely life-threatening." But Edmund waved away her concerns with a weary gesture. "I cannot abandon my people during their greatest time of need," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "The monarchy is under attack, and I must see us through this storm." The storm he referred to was not metaphorical. Public opinion had shifted dramatically since the initial shock of Isabella's crimes had worn off. What had begun as sympathy for the royal family's victimization had evolved into anger at their perceived incompetence and calls for fundamental changes to the monarchical system. Parliament was in emergency session, debating a motion of no confidence in the royal family's ability to manage their own affairs, let alone serve as the symbolic head of the nation. Street protests had grown larger and more organized, with Republican movements gaining unprecedented support from citizens who had previously been loyal monarchists. Prince Alexander entered his father's study carrying a thick folder of documents, his own appearance showing the strain of the past weeks. The confident heir apparent had been replaced by a man haunted by guilt and uncertainty about his future role. "Father," he said quietly, "we need to discuss the latest developments. The situation is deteriorating faster than we anticipated." Alexander spread out the contents of his folder across the desk. The documents painted a picture of institutional failure that went far beyond Isabella's individual crimes. The investigation had revealed that the royal financial oversight systems were woefully inadequate, with minimal checks and balances that had allowed Isabella's fraud to go undetected for years. "The parliamentary committee's preliminary report is devastating," Alexander continued. "They're calling our financial management archaic and irresponsible. They want a complete restructuring of how royal funds are managed and oversight of charitable organizations. But the political challenges were only part of the crisis facing the royal family. The personal toll was becoming increasingly evident as more details of Isabella's deception came to light. The secret recordings she had made of private family conversations had begun to surface in the media, revealing intimate moments that were never meant for public consumption. The most damaging recording had been released just 3 days earlier. It captured a private dinner conversation between Alexander and his father discussing concerns about Isabella's growing detachment from royal duties and her increasingly frequent absences from public engagements. In the recording, Alexander could be heard defending his wife against his father's gentle suggestions that she might need professional help for what appeared to be anxiety or depression. "She's been through so much adjustment," Alexander's voice had said on the tape. "The public scrutiny is intense, and she's doing her best to adapt to royal life. I just need to be more supportive." The irony was painful. Alexander defending Isabella's emotional state while she was secretly using their private conversations to gather intelligence for her criminal activities. The recording had been played repeatedly on news programs, each broadcast driving home the depth of Isabella's manipulation and Alexander's naive trust. "There's something else," Alexander said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Isabella's lawyers have made contact. They want to arrange a meeting." King Edmund looked up sharply, the first sign of real alertness he had shown in days. "Absolutely not. We will have no communication with that woman outside of the formal legal proceedings. Father, I think we need to hear what she has to say. Her lawyers are claiming she has information that could help us understand how this happened and prevent it from happening again. They say she wants to make amends." The king's response was swift and sharp. "Amends? She stole £23 million from charities, corrupted our staff, betrayed our trust, and recorded our private conversations. What possible amends could she make for that level of treachery?" But even as he spoke, Edmund could see the pain in his son's eyes. Despite everything Isabella had done, Alexander was still struggling with the remnants of love he had felt for the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams for nearly 8 years. The king recognized the look because he had worn it himself decades earlier when Alexander's mother, Queen Victoria, had died suddenly, leaving him to navigate both personal grief and royal responsibilities. "Alexander," the king said more gently, "I understand that part of you still feels connected to Isabella, but you must understand that she is no longer the woman you married. Perhaps she never was that woman at all. The person who could systematically steal from children's charities while publicly championing their causes is someone capable of deceptions we can barely imagine." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the study door. Lord Harrison entered with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Your Majesty, Your Highness," he said, slightly out of breath. "There's been a significant development. Isabella has escaped." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabella had been under house arrest at her family's estate outside the capital, under 24-hour police surveillance while awaiting trial. The idea that she could have evaded trained security officers seemed impossible. "How?" Alexander asked, though his voice suggested he almost didn't want to know the answer. "It appears she had help," Harrison explained. "The investigation suggests that she may have had accomplices we hadn't identified. Someone with access to high-level security information planned and executed her escape. The police found the guards drugged and the security system disabled from the inside." King Edmund felt his chest tighten, a physical manifestation of the stress that Dr. Morehouse had warned him about. The thought that Isabella's network of corruption extended even further than they had discovered, possibly including law enforcement or security personnel, was almost too much to bear. "There's more," Harrison continued reluctantly. "Before she disappeared, Isabella left behind a video message. It was sent simultaneously to every major news outlet in the country and internationally. It's already being broadcast." Alexander and his father exchanged a look of dread. Whatever Isabella had to say in her video message, delivered from a position of freedom rather than custody, would likely be designed to inflict maximum damage on the royal family. "What does she say?" Alexander asked, though he was clearly steeling himself for another blow. "She claims that she was not acting alone. She alleges that there are other members of the royal family involved in financial improprieties, and she promises to reveal evidence of widespread corruption within the monarchy. She says she was made a scapegoat for institutional problems that go back decades." The accusation hit both men like a physical assault. The suggestion that Isabella's crimes were part of a larger pattern of royal corruption was perhaps the most damaging thing she could have said. Even if her claims were entirely false, the mere accusation would be enough to destroy any remaining public trust in the monarchy. "She's lying," Edmund said firmly. "She's a desperate woman trying to spread blame to protect herself." But Alexander was studying the documents in front of him more carefully. "Father," he said slowly, "what if there are other problems we haven't discovered yet? What if our financial oversight really has been so poor that other irregularities exist?" The possibility was terrifying to consider, but Alexander was right to be concerned. If Isabella could steal £23 million over 7 years without detection, what else might have gone unnoticed? The royal family's financial affairs were vast and complex, involving dozens of accounts, trusts, and charitable organizations. "We need to authorize a complete forensic audit of everything," Alexander said. "Every account, every transaction, every financial relationship the royal family has had for the past 20 years. If there are other problems, we need to find them before Isabella does." King Edmund nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his son's suggestion even as he dreaded what such an investigation might reveal. The monarchy had survived for 8 centuries by maintaining the trust and respect of the people of Astoria. If that trust was completely shattered by additional revelations of financial mismanagement or corruption, the institution itself might not survive. "Lord Harrison," the king said, "contact the Attorney General and the head of the National Audit Office. I want teams of forensic accountants examining every aspect of royal finances immediately. I also want Isabella found and brought back to face justice." As Harrison left to carry out these instructions, father and son sat in heavy silence. Through the window, they could see that the crowd of protesters outside the palace gates had grown even larger. The calls for abdication and the abolition of the monarchy were becoming louder and more organized. "Alexander," the king said finally, "you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that the monarchy as we know it may not survive this crisis. Isabella's escape and her accusations have created a situation that may be beyond our ability to manage." Alexander nodded, understanding the full weight of what his father was saying. The crown that had been passed down through their family for generations, The institution that had guided Astoria through wars and peace, prosperity, and hardship might end with them. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Golden Haven once again, and both men couldn't help but see it as an omen of the dark days that lay ahead. Isabella's betrayal had set in motion forces that might prove too powerful for even the ancient institution of the monarchy to withstand. The hunt for the escaped princess would begin immediately, but the damage to the crown might already be irreversible. 3 months had passed since Isabella's dramatic escape, and the kingdom of Astoria found itself transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. The ancient walls of Raven's Hollow Palace still stood proud against the winter sky, but the institution they housed had been forever changed by the scandal that had rocked the nation to its core. King Edmund stood in the stateroom, preparing for what would be the most important address of his 37-year reign. The comprehensive forensic audit he had ordered had taken nearly 10 weeks to complete, and its findings had surprised everyone involved in the investigation. The thick report sitting on his desk contained revelations that would reshape not only public perception of the royal family, but also the very structure of the Astorian monarchy. The man addressing the nation that evening bore little physical resemblance to the robust king who had ruled with confidence for nearly 4 decades. The stress of the past months had aged him dramatically, his once thick hair now completely white and his frame noticeably frilier. But there was a new quality in his eyes, a clarity and determination that suggested he had found peace with the difficult decisions that lay ahead. Prince Alexander entered the room wearing the formal military uniform of the Astorian Royal Guard, his medals gleaming under the television lights that had been set up for the broadcast. The transformation in him was perhaps even more dramatic than in his father. The naive trust that had once characterized his approach to relationships had been replaced by a harder wisdom, earned through betrayal and public humiliation. "Are you ready for this, father?" Alexander asked, though both men knew there was no real choice in the matter. The forensic audit had revealed truths that were both better and worse than anyone had anticipated. On one hand, Isabella's crimes appeared to be largely isolated. There was no evidence of widespread corruption within the royal financial systems or involvement by other family members. Her accusations from exile had proven to be desperate lies designed to deflect attention from her own guilt. However, the investigation had uncovered systemic failures in oversight and accountability that painted a picture of an institution that had grown complacent and out of touch with modern standards of transparency. The royal family's financial management, while not criminal, had been archaic and secretive in ways that had enabled Isabella's fraud and could potentially allow similar crimes in the future. "The reforms we're announcing tonight will change everything," Edmund said, reviewing his notes one final time. "Are you certain you're prepared for what this means for your future?" Alexander nodded solemnly. The decision they had reached after weeks of consultation with constitutional experts, parliamentary leaders, and public opinion researchers was radical, but necessary. The monarchy would survive, but only by voluntarily accepting limitations on its power and independence that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of royals. The television cameras began rolling as King Edmund stepped up to the podium that had been positioned in front of the throne that had been occupied by his family for 8 centuries. Across the nation and around the world, millions of viewers tuned in to hear what many expected would be an abdication speech. "My fellow Astorians," the king began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to announce. 3 months ago, our nation was shocked by revelations of criminal behavior within the royal family. Tonight, I stand before you to present the complete findings of the investigation we commissioned and to announce fundamental changes to how your monarchy will operate in the future. He paused, looking directly into the camera with the sincerity that had characterized his entire reign. "First, let me be absolutely clear about the facts. The investigation has confirmed that Isabella Blackthorne, the former princess of Astoria, acted alone in her theft of £23 million from charitable organizations. Her accusations of wider corruption within the royal family have been thoroughly investigated and found to be completely false. This confirmation brought relief to many who had feared that the scandal ran deeper than initially revealed. But the king's next words made it clear that vindication did not mean a return to the status quo. However, he continued, the investigation also revealed that our financial oversight systems were inadequate and outdated. While no other criminal activity was discovered, the lack of proper checks and balances allowed one person to commit crimes over many years without detection. This failure is unacceptable, and it stops today. The king then outlined the most comprehensive reform of royal finances in Asturian history. All royal accounts would be subject to independent audit by the National Audit Office. Charitable organizations associated with the crown would be required to meet the same transparency standards as any other nonprofit organization. Most significantly, Parliament would have unprecedented oversight authority over royal expenditures above a certain threshold. These reforms represent a fundamental change in how the monarchy operates, the king acknowledged. We are voluntarily accepting limitations on our independence because we recognize that public trust must be earned through transparency and accountability, not demanded by tradition alone. But the most shocking announcement was yet to come. As Alexander joined his father at the podium, both men showed the weight of the decision they had reached together. Additionally, the king continued, I am announcing that upon my death or voluntary abdication, the kingdom of Astoria will transition to a constitutional monarchy with significantly reduced royal powers. Future monarchs will serve primarily ceremonial roles, with real governing authority resting entirely with elected officials. The implications of this announcement reverberated far beyond Astoria's borders. Royal families across Europe watched with concern as one of their own voluntarily surrendered centuries of accumulated power and privilege in response to a single scandal. Alexander stepped forward to address the nation directly. I want to speak personally about the betrayal that our family and our nation have experienced, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through every painful revelation of the past months. Isabella Blackthorne deceived me as completely as she deceived all of you. I loved her, trusted her, and believed in her commitment to the values we claim to represent. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But I also failed in my responsibility to ensure proper oversight of the organizations I was associated with. My trust, while understandable as a husband, was negligent as a future king. I accept full responsibility for that failure. Alexander then announced his own decision that shocked even those who thought they were prepared for anything. Therefore, while I will continue to serve as heir to the throne under the new constitutional framework, I will not marry again or produce heirs. Upon my death, the direct royal line will end, and Astoria will complete its transition to a purely elected government. The decision to end the royal bloodline was unprecedented in modern European history. It represented not just a response to scandal, but a recognition that the institution of monarchy itself might be fundamentally incompatible with modern democratic values. The king concluded his address by speaking directly to the victims of Isabella's crimes, to the children who should have received better medical care, to the veterans who deserved more support, to the environmental researchers whose work was delayed. Our family failed you when we failed to protect the charitable organizations that serve you. We will spend whatever time we have remaining as your monarchs working to repair that damage and earn back your trust. As the broadcast ended, father and son stood together in the stateroom, surrounded by centuries of royal portraits and artifacts that would soon lose much of their political significance. Outside, the crowds that had gathered to watch the speech on large screens set up in the palace square erupted in a mixture of applause and debate. Public reaction to the announcements was complex and divided. Many praised the royal family's transparency and willingness to accept responsibility and implement reforms. Others argued that the changes didn't go far enough, while still others felt that ending the royal line was an overreaction to one person's crimes. But Perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the speech, Isabella Blackthorne surrendered herself to authorities at the Asturian embassy in Geneva, Switzerland. The woman who had fled to avoid facing justice apparently found that living as a fugitive was less appealing than facing the consequences of her actions. Her capture revealed the final pieces of her elaborate scheme. Isabella had been living in a series of safe houses funded by the money she had stolen, moving between countries that did not have strong extradition treaties with Astoria. But the isolation and constant fear of discovery had taken its toll on her mental health. "I never intended for it to go this far," she told investigators during her first interview after surrendering. "I thought I could take just enough to feel secure and then stop. But once I started, each step seemed to require another step to cover it up." Isabella's psychological evaluation revealed a complex mix of genuine mental health issues and calculated criminality. The pressure of royal life had indeed affected her severely, but her response to that pressure had been deliberate and sophisticated fraud rather than seeking help or leaving the royal family. Alexander chose not to attend Isabella's trial, which began 6 months after her surrender. The proceedings revealed the full extent of her planning and deception, including evidence that she had been researching royal financial systems and identifying vulnerabilities from almost the moment she married into the family. She was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years if she made full restitution to the affected charities. The judge noted that while her mental health struggles were a mitigating factor, the premeditated nature of her crimes and their impact on vulnerable populations warranted a substantial sentence. As Isabella began her prison term, the Kingdom of Astoria continued its transformation. The constitutional changes announced by King Edmund were formally adopted by Parliament in a series of votes that commanded overwhelming public support. The monarchy's approval ratings, which had plummeted during the scandal, gradually recovered as the reforms were implemented and their effectiveness became apparent. Prince Alexander threw himself into charitable work with a dedication that impressed even his critics. He personally oversaw the establishment of new oversight mechanisms for royal charities and worked tirelessly to rebuild relationships with organizations that had been affected by Isabella's theft. King Edmund, meanwhile, found that the stress of managing the crisis had taken a permanent toll on his health. 2 years after Isabella's conviction, he announced his abdication in favor of Alexander, marking the beginning of the constitutional monarchy they had promised to establish. King Alexander's coronation was deliberately modest, reflecting the new reality of reduced royal power and privilege. In his coronation address, he spoke of service rather than sovereignty, of earning respect rather than commanding obedience. "The crown I wear today is not the same crown that my ancestors wore," he said to the assembled dignitaries and citizens. "It carries less power, but more responsibility. It represents not the divine right of kings, but the consent of free people who have chosen to maintain this institution as a symbol of our shared values and history." The Kingdom of Astoria had emerged from its greatest crisis stronger and more democratic than before. The monarchy survived, but only by adapting to modern expectations of transparency and accountability. Isabella's betrayal, devastating as it had been, had ultimately forced positive changes that might never have occurred without such a dramatic catalyst. Years later, historians would debate whether the Asturian response to the royal scandal represented the salvation of monarchy through reform or the beginning of its gradual obsolescence. But for the people of Astoria, the immediate result was clear. They had a government that was more responsive to their needs and more worthy of their trust. The crown's shadow, cast by Isabella's crimes, had ultimately illuminated the need for change and created the possibility for a better future. In losing a corrupt princess, Astoria had gained a more perfect democracy.